Casual here. A lot of build guides out there, my own included, feature high-end gear that allow you to beat the content with some ease. This isn't realistic though for the vast majority of the player base who won't have put 400 hours into the game. This build guide is for all of you. It is a budget, no legendaries build. More than that, I use this build with level 49 gear to run a gold CT14 solo, which would unlock CT15 and max level gear. Before we start, thanks for all of the great comments on my recent content, and to everyone who has subscribed. It's great to have you on board. Let's get into it. The class tree for this build is very similar to the standard top tree firepower build that everyone seems to use, with a couple of tweaks. My preference is to run assault weapons, and so I've taken Assault Master and Assault Adept over the sniper versions of these abilities. Purge provides an excellent 40% buff to my blighted rounds damage, while a 50% larger mag helps me to always keep it active. Exposing Toxin and Mark for Execution provide a further 35% buff to blighted rounds. The catchily named BL-STM Havoc Nexus buffs my critical damage if I can land a critical hit, and Empowering Antenna rounds things off nicely with a 40% weapon damage buff to the entire party. With all of these buffs to weapon damage, it is easy to see why firepower builds are so powerful. Now let's be realistic, most of us don't land our shots the way a lot of content creators do, particularly if like me you play on a console. My accuracy is just not as good as theirs. On top of that, tier 2 mods are not going to hit as hard as optimised tier 3 mods, and so enemies are going to survive longer and do more damage to me, so I have put more points into survivability than the standard firepower builds. I dropped in nitrogen capsules, which reduces long range distance, and also 2 sides to the power, which increases damage by 20% but at the expense of taking 15% more damage, something I just don't think I can afford to take. These extra points allowed me to pick up Blur Screen, improving my health regeneration threshold, and Anita Plates, which buffs my resistance by 20%. Finally, I took Suction Module, which improves my weapon leech by 5% over Sower of Decay, which reduces the cooldown and decay skills. To be honest, I would always do this as the cooldown on blighted turrets is so short that you don't need to reduce it further, and ideally blighted rounds is never down. Speaking of skills, blighted rounds should be no surprise given this is a firepower build. I've taken blighted turret as well so that I can keep empowering antenna up all the time for its 40% weapon damage buff, but have modded it to freeze with the ice component mod. I prefer freeze over toxic for its crowd control, even I can hit headshots on frozen enemies, and also to avoid toxic killing an enemy causing toxic lead to not proc. The final skill I take is Cold Snap, which I really like. Having an on-demand crowd control is awesome and it regularly gets me out of trouble. On top of that, when it is coupled with Icicle Storm, it's a great nuke to wipe out packs and damage elites. Look, I know what you're thinking. I said this was a build on a budget and that's a tier 3 mod. I think you'll let me have this one though, because you can buy this mod from Tiago, so there's no real grinding needed to get it. Let's have a look at the gear and mods. All of my armour has bonus firepower on it. This is critical for the build really. For my other stats I have focused on buffs to long range damage on every piece, close range damage on 3 pieces, and healing buffs on the other 2 as a small increase to my survivability. If you are struggling to survive, I would add a few more of the healing buffs to your armour. I picked up some of the standard tier 2 damage dealing mods for a firepower build. Bloodlust, which increases firepower by up to 45,000. Crit Stack, which further increases firepower by up to 34,000. Dum Dum Bullets, which is a flat 10% buff to weapon damage. Freezing Boost to increase damage against frozen enemies by 15%, and Radical Therapy to do the same against enemies afflicted with Toxic. All pretty standard stuff really. For survivability, I'm running Damage Absorber, which gives a flat buff to armour and resistance, along with Perseverance Shield. Many firepower builds run Mitigation from Death, but I don't like that mod for a few reasons. Firstly, you only have a buff up when you are killing enemies. So prior to combat starting, or when you are overwhelmed and moving to a better position, you can find yourself exposed without the buff being up at all. On top of that, it doesn't buff resistance at all, so you're very vulnerable to anomaly damage. But the big one for me is the diminishing return on armour stacking, which makes this quite an inefficient mod. I can show you this by swapping out my chest piece. My base armour is 38,000 without this, which provides physical damage reduction of around 43%. Equipping the chest piece takes me up to 93,500 armour, a 146% increase. But my physical damage reduction has only increased by around 50%, to damage reduction of 65%. The diminishing returns increase until you hit the cap of 85% physical damage reduction. I suspect that if you can get all three stacks up on mitigation from death, that you could get close to this, but in reality you probably won't. And so it's only maybe a 10% improvement over damage absorber, whose buff is always up. Perseverance Shield is one of my favourite survivability mods because it provides damage mitigation against physical and anomaly damage, giving you time to heal up before the next big hit. For my main weapon I went with a pretty standard tactical assault rifle. The stats on this gun are not great. Ideally I would have long and close range damage and possibly critical damage, albeit armour piercing is a good stat for console users, given hitting critical hits can be tough. For mods on the weapon, bone shrapnel is your go-to. Any damage mods need to do damage after the kill to ensure that toxic lead procs properly and you keep blighted rounds up all the time. Minefield would also work, and also Icebreaker, albeit it is quite situational. For my other mod, I went with one that's really not used that much, Critical Point, which boosts critical hit chance by 15%. I actually found that this procced quite often, and with the critical damage multiplier of the gun made quite a difference to my damage output. In addition, it procs crit stack, increasing firepower as well. There are a few alternatives to this though. Damage Link is a good buff to your AoE damage, Gravedigger's Frenzy buffs your critical damage, Perpetuum Mobile helps with keeping blighted rounds up, and Essence Thief helps with survivability, albeit it is a little vague on by how much. I would avoid bullets that apply status effects, as these could cause toxic lead not to proc. My secondary weapon is for when blighted rounds is down. I'm using a tactical submachine gun with death chains and claymore on it, but you can use pretty much whatever weapon and damage mods you prefer here, as you won't be using it much. I do think that death chains is one of the strongest tier 2 damage dealing mods, so do look out for it. In terms of playstyle, this is a typical firepower build. Blighted rounds should be up all the time if possible. Your turret should be used on cooldown to keep up the 40% weapon damage buff from Empowering Antenna. Train packs of smaller enemies to elites when Cold Snap is up, so you can nuke them with Icicle Storm and Bone Shrapnel. Finally, keep moving. Survivability is not bad, but you are quite vulnerable when Perseverance Shield is on cooldown, so avoid those big hits. This is a great build while you are grinding up the CT ladder and looking for those infrequent legendary drops. Firepower builds are the strongest by a long way, so if you're after those record times, this is where you start. Until next time, Casual out.